All right, just to remind us, let's do a little summary of what we said before. What did we say? That in this week's Torah portion, that it talks about the land of Israel was divided up to the tribes. And God said it was a commandment to divide the land up by means of lots. They took 24 lots. On 12 of them, they wrote the area, the number, whatever, of each area. The land was already pre-divided into 12 areas. And on the other 12, they wrote the names of each tribe. And each head of each tribe would come and pull out one lot, which magically had his name on it. He would always pull out his lot and pull out another lot. And the lots would cry out, I am the lot of Naphtali, and the area of land is number 12. It would cry out. So the question of the Rebbe was, why does it have to cry out? What possible purpose could it have that the lot itself yelled out? Especially when it said that the Aliyah, the high priest, he put on the breastplate, and the breastplate, it verified the choice that was made. And they already saw it was miracles. I mean, the person pulled out exactly his name. Why did it have to? So the answer the Rebbe gives is that even though that these lots were only a means to an end, and they were not an end in themselves, it was not a commandment, it was just a necessary step in the commandment of dividing up the land of Israel. And at first glance, it was not that important. You know, it was a step, it was an important step, but it wasn't the main thing. And the Rebbe said, no, that when you're dealing with holiness, when you're dealing with the commandment of God, then every step to achieve that desire of God, every step which leads up to that is also holy. It's also important. And it has to be done with every aspect of your soul, thought, speech, and action. So that came to show that these lots, even though the main thing was just the action and the thought, right? The thought was dividing up the land. That's the idea behind it. And the action, pulling them out. But nevertheless, the lot yelled out to show that there has to be total involvement even in the means to the end. The path to the goal is as important as the goal is. In very simple English, right? The means do not justify the end. The goal does not justify the means. You can't say my goal is X, therefore I can lie and cheat, and the means I use are not important. Right? It says no, exactly the opposite. Every second is a goal. There's a bigger goal. The big goal is the ultimate goal. But every instant has to be that you're involved in achieving this goal. Every instant is important and has to be done with total involvement. Thought, speech, and action. And this, the Rebbe wants to say, has a connection also to a story which was told about the Tzemach Tzedek, that someone once told him, of course, the Tzemach Tzedek, he lived in Lubavitcher. It was in White Russia. And he said he wanted to come to the land of Israel. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, make here Israel. Make Israel here. So the Rebbe says, does this make any sense? I mean, the Tzemach Tzedek certainly knew that White Russia is almost as far away from Israel as you can get, like, spiritually. Right? In Israel, it's totally, even now in the time of exile, the Israel is totally different. First of all, spiritually it's different, and also according to the laws it's different, right? And it's a wonderful thing. A Jew living in Israel, what's the question? Right? Nevertheless, he said, no, make here Israel. Because according to this, we can understand in the service of man, in place and time, behetam lahoras, according to what the Tzemach Tzedek said before, that it said that a Jew that wanted to come up to the land of Israel, and he wanted to learn Torah over there. And he said, make here Israel. Make in Lubavitch, that's Israel. Now, this is not, how could he say a thing like that? Even though the Khan outside of Israel is not Israel, I'm sure that Tzemach Tzedek was very, very aware, right? That outside of Israel is not Israel. Avodah chutz la'oretz, the service outside of Israel in the time of exile, is just a preparation for the service of the true redemption that Moshiach will bring us to the land of Israel. That's the whole idea. Like the Jewish people, we pray every day that God should take us to Israel, that God should bring Moshiach, and Moshiach will take us to Israel. Avokiv and Yoseinu Begalo, since we are in exile and we're out of Israel. So what's the Baal Shem? What is he trying to tell him? The Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek was not, anti-Israel or something. He wasn't trying to devaluate the importance of being in Israel, or devaluate, for sure not. Ella, but he was saying, listen, my friend, the fact of the matter is you are now in exile. You're not in Israel. You are, but with hashgacha pratis, whatever reason it is, God put you here. There's certain Jews that they have to go to the land of Israel. When Mashiach comes, every Jew automatically go to the land of Israel. The Rambam says only Mashiach will bring everyone to Israel. He's the ultimate expert. Only Mashiach will bring everyone to Israel. He'll build a temple. And because of the temple, all the Jews will want to do. The Mashiach will make all the Jews want to do the commandments. And then he'll build the temple. It says the temple will come from heaven, according to one opinion. However it is, the Mashiach will be the one that will cause the temple to be built. The only way Jews can do all the commandments is when there's the temple and in Israel. And so the idea, the commandments is what's going to draw the Jews to Israel. The Jews will want to do the commandments, they want to be in Israel. So therefore, but before Mashiach brings this redemption and builds the temple, before that happens, there's some Jews that should be in Israel, and there's some Jews that should not be in Israel. They have jobs to do. Yesh kavana v'tachlis, you have a purpose wherever you are. Just like we said, like the lots, were just a means to an end. And the lots had to be totally involved, thoughts, action, and speech. Everything had to be involved. The same thing, you're like one of the lots. You're deciding how to divide up the land of Israel. So every moment that we're preparing the world for coming to Israel, this is something like the intention, preparing for the intention that will be done, the service in exile. This is a preparation for. Okay, and therefore, Tzarech Yehudi, a Jew, has to service here. But Makom was a manzeh, in this place, the Tachlis and the Shlemus in the ultimate completion, according to all of his powers that he's got. But Machshava, Dibur, Maisa, thought, speech, and action. Kapanimi, like we said, like a genuine Jew, a genuine, how do you say, totally involved. Panimi means from the inside. Shamunach Lagamri, that he is totally involved in this service of bringing Mashiach in order to bring the Jews to the land of Israel. But sometimes it requires you to be outside of the land of Israel. Who knows? The Rebbe knows. Therefore, when you are doing your service outside of Israel, you're not thinking at the time you're doing this preparation about anything else or what's going to happen afterwards. What does it mean? What is he supposed to do outside of Israel? To make God a dwelling place in the world. Like the language that said, Asakan Eretz Israel. He has to make Lubavitch, he has to make whatever is Ukraine, right? The Ukraine, the Kiev, into the land of Israel. What does that mean, to make it land of Israel? It means lasod mimakom uzman zeh, to make the place and the time wherever you are a land which is recognizable, that the Jewish people are there. Heyot Yehudi Yisrael, because every Jew is Israel. The call makom shu, no matter where he is. Yesh b'kocho lasos mimakom bo hu nimsa. A Jew can make wherever he is the land of Israel. In other words, let's say it another way. What is better? What would you say is better for a Jew to actually physically be in the land of Israel, but spiritually he's totally out of it? No connection to Torah, no connection to commandments, no connection to this, or to be outside of the land of Israel and do the Torah and the commandments. He says, well, it depends. If the reason you're doing the Torah and the commandments outside of Israel is to prepare the Jewish people to come to the land of Israel, because that's the only thing that's going to bring the Jewish people to the land of Israel is when they all want to do the commandments. Then the Holy Temple will draw them to Israel. But if they're in the land of Israel only because it's a nice place or whatever it is, that you can make money here or something like, they don't even know why. So the smallest challenge will take them out of the land of Israel. As we see this, who knows how many Jews, I don't even know if they have a number, that live outside of Israel. Ubafrat, and especially in the shul, the synagogues and the places where they learn outside of Israel, that in the end it says they're going to fly to the land of Israel. That's what it says. That all of the synagogues and they're all going to fly to the land of Israel. Yeterem Yizu, even more, Dav Kal Yadei by means of this, that you do the service in Shlemus. It's just like in the desert, right? When they had the 42 journeys, in each one of the journeys, they set up the whole entire tabernacle. They set the whole thing up. And there were some places where they just for one day or whatever. And then they took it apart. But wherever they were, they made that place a permanent place, even though they knew very clearly that it wasn't permanent. Because that was the preparation for the ultimate goal to come to the land of Israel. Therefore, even more, but only by means of this that you do the complete service of God here outside of Israel in Gullus, in exile, Munachim Lagamri, and you are totally involved in that service outside of Israel, on the way to Israel, so to speak, in thought, speech, and action. Harizet Gufa, this itself accustoms the person and brings him to the ultimate purpose. Shilishma, who also that for which he is doing the commandment here, if he really makes outside of Israel, then when he gets to the land of Israel, then he'll really appreciate it. Because inside of his heart is broken. He's not really in the land of Israel. It's just a preparation. Avoda Beretz, then when he does get to the land of Israel, then it'll be in the Geula Amitit Shlima by means of Mashiach. Then, like the rabbis say, that the mitzvahs nowadays, they're just like signs. They're not the real thing. When the Mashiach comes and brings everybody to Israel, it says, Keshatem chozrim lo yu lechem chadashim. Why should you do the commandments now? Because when the Mashiach comes and the commandments will really be filled with godliness, it won't be a new thing. And especially it's talking about the preparation for the future redemption. Shenyane is, like it says, emes v'shlemos b'kol inyani. What's this idea of the future redemption? The revelation and completion of all good potential. Everything will be whole and healthy. B'kol prati metzios adam va'olam. The whole world and every nation, there won't be any more lies, there won't be any more deceit, no more hatred, no more ignorance and famine. So Mashiach will do. There's enough in the world to provide for everybody. Not even provide for everybody, to provide for 1,000 times more than the population we have now. When moving from this is understood that the whole idea of this future redemption that we're talking about, that the whole thing is revelation. Every detail, the wholesomeness, and the potential and everything, even things which are just a preparation for the future redemption, talui b'zeh, depends that when you are, the whole thing depends on what you do outside of Israel. Avodat Adam hi bishleimut amachshava dibur. Outside of Israel also can be Tel Aviv. I mean, it can also be Bnei Brak and Kfar Chabad. That's also outside of Israel. Until the temple is built in Israel, Israel is not really Israel. It's true geographically, certainly it is, and spiritually it is, but actually, right, until the temple is here and all the Jewish people live, there's a lot of laws that depend on the temple and depend on only when all the Jewish people are on the land. Then Osa Kan Eretz Israel, you'll make here the land of Israel, not in a way that it's recognized that it's preparation for something else. Then the land of Israel will really be the land of Israel, but it also depends on our appreciating it. If we are always constantly preparing and treating every place that there is as godly and holy, because what's the whole thing of Eretz Israel? Eretz Israel, it reveals the creator of the whole universe. Eretz Israel is not the only place that God creates, just like the Jewish people aren't the only people that God creates. God creates everything. The idea of Israel, it says in the future, Israel is going to spread out to the whole world. And the whole world will realize what God is. So therefore, when you're outside of Israel now, prepare for it. Prepare for this. But davka b'avodas shleimus, only when you're serving God completely here, kan, outside of Israel, in the time of exile, ad kamasharach, as much as you can, at avodas shleimus, this accustoms the person and brings him to shleimus avodah be'eretz Israel in the gula amitit shlema, which will be only done by Moshiach. But that certainly is the goal of Moshiach, is to bring everybody to the land of Israel. That's his goal. But it's the coming to the land of Israel is a spiritual thing as much as it is physical, and both this have to be joined together. Because the whole idea of coming to the land of Israel is not spiritual, and it's not only spiritual, not only physical. It's godly. It's godly. It's a revelation of the essence of God himself in the physical and the spiritual. So therefore, when you're not in Israel physically, so at least be there spiritually, right? Be there spiritually. And then when you come to the land of Israel, then you'll join that spiritual with the actual physical, and that's what reveals the essence. That's the Holy Temple. That's what it means. Now we can understand why the Tzemach Tzedek said, make here the land of Israel, Hagam, even though that he knew very clearly that we are found in exile, and in one instant, everyone will leave Ukraine and whatever, White Russia, and they will go to the land of Israel. But nevertheless, the Tzemach Tzedek told this man, don't go to the land of Israel. Make here Israel first. Tzaricha avoda, nevertheless, because the service now has to be here outside of Israel to be complete from Alpia Matzav the Akshavi, according to the situation and conditions that are now. According to the conditions now, certain people must be Jews, must be outside of Israel, and must prepare the world for coming to Israel. Therefore, make Lubavitcher and Moscow and whatever it is, San Francisco, whatever, make it all as much as Israel as you can. But it has to be Asakane Eretz Israel to make here Israel. I think I told you a lot of times, I'll tell you again. Let me just finish this. L'hachnis kan, you have to bring here in time and place, no matter where you are, you have to make that into the land of Israel. That's shlemot matzav agula, to bring the entire redemption as much as possible. Al derech panimi, like a genuine Jew that puts completion, wholesomeness in every single thing that he does to serve God. Even things which are only a preparation for another goal. So here we have two things so far. First of all, wherever you are, you have to now serve God in a way of land of Israel. Number two, you have to make this Eretz Israel in a complete way, a total way, in a way that'll prepare you to actually come to the land of Israel and totally. And number three, this will accustom the Jewish people to think about the future redemption. Because after all, outside of Israel is definitely not Israel. It's not Israel. And everyone will do the most they can to make Chicago into Eretz Israel and Detroit into Eretz Israel and every place in the world Eretz Israel as much as you can. But after all, Zelo Zeh, it's not a land of Israel. So everybody will know they're just really preparing themselves and longing to actually connect these two things together. This will actually bring the future redemption in a complete way. When all the Jewish people will come to the land of Israel, and then it says, Atidim Eretz Israel, that the land of Israel will spread out in all of the world. then the whole world will really realize and feel the oneness of God. I told you this before, but I'll tell you it again. There was a letter that somebody wrote, somebody in South Africa, and he wrote a letter that he wanted to come to the land of Israel, and he wanted to make Aliyah, and he just wanted a blessing from the Rebbe. So the Rebbe said, not so fast. Said, first of all, you have to understand that the land of Israel is a holy land. It's a holy land. And you have to prepare for it. You have to prepare for the holiness. You have to elevate yourself in holiness before you go to the land of Israel. Number one. Number two, you have to be sure that you have something to contribute to the land, to the people, you have to be sure you have something to contribute there. You're not just going there in order to elevate yourself and to learn more Torah and this. You have something in order to contribute. You're going to maybe teach people Torah. Okay, that's good. You're encouraging other people. Something you have to contribute. Think about it. Number three, said the Rebbe, is you have to be sure that you're not going to be dependent on the government for money, for whatever. You're not going to be dependent. That you're going there autonomous. You're not going to be a leech. You're not. And number four, said the Rebbe, you have to make sure that you're not weakening the place that you're leaving. And the Rebbe brought as an example that they came from the Sochnut in Israel, and they convinced the leaders, the big rabbis in Morocco, to come to the land of Israel, and then all their followers, their congregations would come after them. Said the Rebbe that they convinced them. The leaders did come to the land of Israel, but the followers did not. The followers, because that the leaders, the big rabbis, they left, so the people were without inspiration, without direction. And most of them, they went to France. They spoke French. They went to Spain, and there they completely assimilated. And weakened. So you cannot weaken the place where you're leaving. Yud Aleph. I know that there were people in Russia that they were shochatim. They knew what a shochat, and they had permission to come to the land of Israel. And the Rebbe said, who's going to slaughter the meat over there? You have to find somebody, prepare people that'll take your place. If not, you can't come up. You can't leave the people just for your own personal inyan zeh mudgash yoter in the fact that this year Parshat Pinchas is Shabbat Mavorchim. This year, that's what it is. Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av. Menachem Av this year will be, the Rosh Chodesh is going to be on Yom Shishi. This year it's going to be on Shabbos of the year. This year, this Shabbat, coming Shabbat, is Shabbat Mavorchim, and the Shabbat after that will be Rosh Chodesh. Even though that in the Torah it's called, this month is called the month of Av, not Menachem Av. But the custom of the Jewish people is to call it Menachem Av. What's the difference? Av means father, and Menachem means to comfort. As Mosifim, we add the word Menachem. And even more, we begin the name of the month, we call it Menachem Av. That's what we call it, Menachem Av. Okay, there's a lot we have to be comforted for in this month, because this is the month that the temple was destroyed. This is also the month when the spies came back and convinced the Jews not to come to the land of Israel. Yesh Lomo, we can say that one of the reasons is this, since that Menachem, in that Nechemas HaGeula, this refers to the comfort that the future redemption will bring. Hu HaKavan v'Tachlis Aridus Av. That's the whole reason that all these terrible things happened in the month of Av. And even more, Menachem, this redemption, that will be our comforter. He is Ha'atchala Shabo Lifnei Kolin Yerida. This came beforehand, before all the bad things. The comfort was already there. Like the rabbis say, Ruach Elokim Rachefes al Panei Hamayim, like it says in the first day of creation, it says that the Spirit of God was hovering on the face of the water. It says this is the Spirit of Moshiach. Shemiyad b'techilat habriya, even the beginning, at the very beginning of the creation, there already was the Spirit of the Moshiach. Kivin shegeula, because the whole idea of the future redemption, this is the foundation and the whole purpose, the inner reason why there were all these things that happened in the middle. Even of, which is the source of everything. Of, it says like Avotenu is the father of everything. Makar lakol inyanim. Av is like the father, the beginning of everything, right? Is the father of everything, even the holy things. That's the level of. And all the destruction and terrible things that happen, this really sort of, how do you say, weakened and brought sadness and misery to the Jewish people. But because there's the Menachem came first, this gives the power that when there does come this tremendous descent into exile, which was caused by the destruction of the temple, that the whole thing is it says this whole exile becomes something like the lots. It's true the exile is just a means to the end, but while we're here, we have to sink ourselves totally into improving every single moment. Like the Rebbe said, make every moment of exile into the land of Israel. Aliyah, this is the Menachem, this is what's going to comfort us. And by knowing that what the work that we're doing is in order to bring the future redemption, therefore we sink our thought, speech, and action, our whole soul into improving every moment, like it's known. That's the Menachem. That the whole idea of the future redemption is comes from the word geula, comes from the word gola, exile, and you just put an aleph into it. In other words, 4/5 of the redemption is the exile and the terrible suffering that we're suffering now. Since that by means of the just putting the aleph into it, this itself becomes geula, becomes the future redemption. And now because we're on Shabbos Mavorchim, or the month of in the Shabbos that we bless, is Menachem of, so we can feel even more the inner intention of why we are in exile, the 4 letters of Gola. What's the reason behind it? We can feel the aleph that's supposed to be put into Gola and make it into Geula. Like it says on Shabbos in general, and on all the Shabboses in these 3 weeks, and there is an elevation that is in the time. Nim says that really this is all for in order to bring the future redemption, so we can feel it a little bit in every, especially in every Shabbat. This gives a power of Israel that we can make here the land of Israel, and to bring the future redemption, b'poel the goal. Let's do the last one. And this adds even more, especially in our generation, in our time, a special emphasis of Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av, and this year that falls on Yom Shishi, this year it falls, like we said, on Shabbos, that then everything is prepared for the meal. Just like Adam Rishon that was created on Yom Shishi. So we find now also in the Elef Shishi, and right before we're coming into the 7,000th Eon, Shehu Keneged Yom HaShishi, this corresponds to Yom HaShishi, and in it, Erev Shabbos L'achar Chatzot. Said the Rebbe, now we're on, what year? Back then it was, how much more so now? So let's just talk about now. We're at 5,781 years after the creation of the world. As soon as it comes into the 6,000th year, that already begins the 7,000th period, right? The first 1,000 that began as soon as the world was created. The second 1,000 ended, and now we're coming in. Now we are in Erev Shabbos. Alpi call it Simani Agula, according to all the signs of the future redemption. Anakabar Mamish, we are now right next to the redemption. Kafisha Odia, like it's like it was already advertised the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, that we've already finished everything. including shining up the buttons for the parade. We finished. Everyone only has to be ready, prepared. Hainu, shakal, shakavar, hakal, mukhan lasud. Everything is prepared for the future redemption. All we have to do is just go to and eat the meal of the Leviathan and Sudas of Shura Bar, even though it's pretty hard to see what type of redemption is right behind Kivin Shahine, Moshiach Bo, take of Miyad Mamash. Okay, you can look around, you don't really see so much of a redemption over there. I mean, there's terrible things happening, but the Rebbe says it's happening. The way I explain it, how I explain it, is let's say a person gets in a terrible automobile accident and they bring him into an operation. Operation takes a long time, and the family is really worried outside. And the doctor comes out and says, the operation has been a success, right? Your grandfather is going to live. Can we see him? Yes, but you have to see him through the window because he's in a special recuperation room. They look in the window and they see there he is. He's got like tubes everywhere. He's being artificially breathing. He's got a heart machine and an eye machine and a lung machine and this machine and everything is run by machines. The family looks and they start to cry. Oh, grandpa. Says, doctor, you fooled us. Says, listen, the doctor says, I know what I'm talking about. He's healthy. It's going to take a little bit. From the outside, it looks terrible. I admit, I didn't realize the shock you have. But believe me, he's 100%. He's going to be better now than he was when he was 20 years old. We made a few replacements. We made a few this. We cleaned up his eyeballs. We did this. His heart is brand new. His lungs are brand new. Everything is brand new. We washed his brain off with whatever it is. And then everything is brand new, but you can't see it. So it's the same thing. We look at the world, and the world looks terrible. What are you talking about? This is the future redemption. But the Rebbe is the doctor. The doctor says, listen, don't go overboard. The fact of the matter is that for sure, don't bury him, right? Your grandpa, he's going to be better. Don't worry. In another minute, it's going to work. Okay. So there we are. The redemption is here. Meanwhile, we are in the stages. We are throwing the lots. And it has to be done totally, completely with all of our being. And when that happens, then coming into the land of Israel will be totally different than it is today. Now let's do the Yom Yom. We didn't do the Yom Yom. Here it is. There are 4 types of deep thinking, hidboner, contemplation. First of all, when you're studying, you learn a mimer and you understand the mimer Hasidut until you intellectually you understand it. You get the idea, the amazing wisdom and intellect of the Rebbe. You get the whole idea. Then after that, you think about it deeply before you pray. This, you start to feel that the ideas that the Rebbe is talking about are really alive. He's really talking about reality, godliness, intellect, life. So we've called him, Mamali called him. Oh, you start to feel this, I don't really exist, God. That's the second step. Third step is you feel the godliness of the idea. You feel the real true godliness that the idea is not just something inside of me, I'm inside of it. These are the 3 steps on the ladder of sensitivity, of realization is a better word. It is only by God's kindness toward us that once in a while we sense godliness without doing any service. It comes to us automatically. You suddenly get a thought, oh, God exists. This comes because of the essential godly Jewish soul. But that's not what God wants. God wants our efforts. Our efforts require these 3 forms. So a lot of times you see this like, but Bali Tshuva. It used to be anyway. I don't know how it is now, but Bali Tshuva used to be a person, all of a sudden he gets this shot, what am I doing? I'm a Jew, I got it, right? And suddenly he gets all inspired and he's a Jew and he starts reading about Judaism and he buys tefillin and he leaves the bars and whatever it is and he becomes and then it starts to sort of slow down a little bit. It starts to slow down because it was a free gift in the beginning. But now he has to really integrate that into his day-to-day personality, and he hasn't got a personality. He just sort of wiped the whole thing out to be religious. So that's what he says now. The way you get this new set of values, true values, is by prayer. And that's what we're talking about in the Maimer also. Step number one, to understand the Maimer of, you learn Chassidut, you learn the Maimer, understand it. Number two, you feel the life, that it becomes alive. Oh, it's not just an intellectual idea like you're reading a spy novel or something like that. Suddenly the Maimer becomes really alive, godliness. And the third one is you feel, right? You feel not just the life of it, right? It's something that inspires inside of you. You surrender yourself to the godliness that the Maimer is explaining. It's opening your eyes to. Have a good day with Moshiach now. See you at 3:00, I hope.